evening. I'm Pat Simpson, President of the Historical Society of East Rockaway in Lynbrook. Every year we give a retro, which is a presentation for fourth grade students, every student in East Rockaway and Lynbrook. This June, when it was over, Art and Nori had come in and they were helping us break down. And Art walked out of the library with such enthusiasm about the Battle of Plattsburgh that I turned around, came back into the library, and booked a night for him to give us a presentation. And may I introduce to you Art Mattson, our village historian, the village historian of Lynbrook, and board member of the Historical Society.
Thank you very much, Pat. And thanks for the audience. We had an interesting question and answer session before we began. And among all the folks here, we kind of assembled a fair outline of what was involved in the Battle of the War of 1812. But the title today is The War of 1812, What You Never Learned in School. So the things you all said are important, but what I'm going to tell you about tonight, you definitely did not learn in school. Now, every summer, Nori, could you dance a slide? I have my guested dancer here, my wife, Nori. We generally add an aside. We go up to Lake George every summer to a motorcycle rally with about 30 to 40,000 motorcycles. And this year, coincidentally, at the same time we planned that, there was a lecture up in Plattsburgh, a bunch of historians getting together, lecture series, to talk about the battle there 200 years ago, because it was September 11, 1814. And it was a bit of a turning of tables, because I'd done a lecture up that way, up at Skidmore College in Saratoga, and my lecture was on Lynbrook. It was about the graveyard here in our cemetery, with 139 people in it, the victims of two shipwrecks on the south coast of Long Island. In fact, if you click forward, we'll get an idea, first of all, where those places are. You can see that Plattsburgh is way up at the top there. Lake George is about 2/3 up. That's where the motorcycle rally was. And just near Lake George was where I'd given a lecture on my book, Water and Ice. If you just go down a little bit. This is a woodcut from the time about the Battle of Plattsburgh. As I say, I knew nothing about it. I'm embarrassed to admit that although I had written these two books and had presented up there, my knowledge was so scant. Almost everything I learned there was fresh and brand new. And so they had to turn the tables on me. They'd come to my lecture, knew nothing about the tremendous importance of the two shipwrecks here on Long Island and of the graveyard here in Lynbrook. And I got to learn the incredible importance of this battle. Now, one of the presenters next was Keith Heralco. Herculo. He was one of the presenters, wrote this book, and he and others had traveled to England, to London, and looked at the war archives because they were interested in what the British side was, things that had never been published in the typical books on the Battle of the War of 1812. And his finding resulted in this book, and it shed new light on the importance of this battle and how the United States came within a few anchors and chains in a couple of hours of experiencing total disaster. Next. And thus we have the War of 1812, what you never learned in school. I was handed history I'd never had before, and that has resulted, after I did substantial research on my own, in tonight's presentation. Next one. Now, if you're like me, you'll need a quick reminder of what the War of 1812 was all about. When I spoke to the folks in the audience before, you had a fair idea when I assembled it from various people, different ones had different ideas, but it was fairly accurate. It was July, 1812, the United States declared war on the great power in the world, Great Britain. And the British at that time were fighting Napoleon. They had no wish to be fighting in North America at that time. Now, the U.S. had several grievances with Britain. One of them was that there were tremendous trade restrictions. After all, Great Britain was at war with France and with Napoleon. And so they had a blockade around the entire Iberian Peninsula of Spain and Portugal and part of France. They had no desire to also fight over here, and they also were telling the U.S., you cannot trade with France or French colonies in the Caribbean. You must not. So they put trade restrictions on us. The British also were stopping our ships. I use the word impressing. That is, to seize American sailors and put them into the British Navy, because their Navy was under tremendous stress with this blockade they had of the Iberian Peninsula. And finally, the British were supporting Indians in North America, American Indians who wanted independence, wanted a sovereign nation, and did not want the Americans to expand into their territory. Another unstated reason, actually was stated by some, including Thomas Jefferson, was to invade Canada. We wanted to take over Canada. Many people in the U.S. thought that it was natural for the United States to expand into Canada. Well, after 2.5 years, the war ended in a draw. A peace treaty was signed that pretty much meant that things were back the way they were, with borders as they had been. And it's been referred to as a war fought over nothing that ended in a draw. And that's pretty much what we're taught in school. Now, next one. No, I had talked about that before, sorry. We've been attacked in this country 4 times by foreign powers. This is one, September 11th. And the most recent, excuse me. And before that, next one, Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. And twice during the War of 1812. Let's see, the first one is that, the burning of Washington, D.C., and that was in August 24th, 1814, when the British attacked Washington, D.C., and set fire to both the Capitol and the White House. Next. And there was, 2 weeks later, the attack on September 14, 1814. The British gathered 10,000 troops, the largest enemy force ever amassed on U.S. soil, and attacked the city of Plattsburgh by land and sea. 16 ships on Lake Champlain to go with the 10,000 hardened troops. Next one. Now, unlike the attacks on the Twin Towers, or the December 7th, or the burning of Washington, all those attacks succeeded. This attack did not. And that changed everything. The attack was defended brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly by the Americans, both on Lake Champlain and on the land, despite being outnumbered 3-1. And despite what you may have heard, learned in school, the decisive battle of War of 1812, not in Baltimore or Washington, D.C. or Fort McHenry, it was at Plattsburgh. Had the British succeeded there, the United States would likely not exist in the way that it exists today. And sadly, few people do appreciate what this incredible battle meant to our country. They call it, in the history books, pretty much an unimportant skirmish in an unimportant war. Next slide. This is Thomas Jefferson, 3rd president of our country. He was an advocate of the war. Not only that, he wanted to take over Canada. Strong advocate of doing that. He said that within a week we could take Montreal, and within another week we'd be in Quebec. That was his claim. The president at the time was President James Madison, our 4th president, in office from 1809 to 1817. So during the entire war, he was our president. Now, he was under some pressure from war-thumping war hawks that wanted to declare war on Britain. And he did, next slide, sign the declaration of war that Congress presented to him. And I do agree with the history books. The war was declared for weak reasons. And I also agree that the war was fought to a draw. Next slide. But where I differ from the history books, and where I differ from what you were taught in school, is that, as I said, the most important battle of the war, which is not even mentioned in history books, is the Battle of Plattsburgh, not Fort McHenry, not Baltimore, not the Battle of New Orleans, not the Battle of the Constitution against the Guerriere, not the battle on the lakes. And you will learn that that one battle profoundly affected the history of the United States. But before I give you my take on the war, I want to give you 4 other takes on the war. And there 3 of them at least are quite valid. The first one is the British version. We burned Washington and taught them a lesson. So forget about it. I'll leave it back. Actually, you can go forward. I'm sorry. Yes, and this British historian William Kingsford wrote, "The events of the War of 1812 have never been forgotten in England, for they have never been known there." To the British, the War of 1812 was fought against a pack of blackguards, the Americans, who needed to be taught a lesson. How could we? How could we fight them at this time in 1812, when they were in a death struggle with Napoleon on the continent? And in fact, the books in England do spend whole chapters and whole many books about the Napoleonic Wars, but only pages, a few pages about the War of 1812. Well, you can understand why when you look at these numbers. Well, there's a picture of Napoleon. The next slide. 3,500,000 died in the Napoleonic Wars. 3,500,000. Compare that to 20,000 who died in the War of 1812. And so you can see why the British would say it's a forgotten, a meaningless war. And it's hard for me to disagree with the Brits. Let's look at the second interpretation of the war, which is the Canadian interpretation. We won, let us never forget. Next slide. This is a depiction of the Battle of York, where the Americans came and burned the capital of Ontario, York, which is today Toronto. To the Canadians, the Americans were the aggressors, and we were. But the Canadians beat back the Americans in 10 battles. 10 battles, far more than we beat them. Of course, it was Canadians with British. It was a combination of locals and British troops. So by beating us back, the borders of Canada were made secure. And there also began a pretty long identification with the British Empire in Canada. Next. And so when Nori and I visited Toronto, we saw images like this up there, celebrating the War of 1812 as a tremendous victory of the Canadians. And I find it hard to disagree with the Canadians. I mean, after all, they did whip us 10 times. Next depiction here, the version number 3, the American Indian version. The war was a total, unmitigated disaster. The Indians have the story exactly right. Next slide. Most of them had allied themselves with the British, and they got, of course, worse than anyone else. They not only lost this fellow, Tecumseh, who was the leader of the Indian Confederation and hoped to have a sovereign nation, but they lost any chance, whatever, of ever gaining that sovereignty that they were looking for. And they lost the permanent protection of the British. The British, at the end of the war, were no longer permitted with the peace treaty to support the Indian nation. And this then resulted in, the next slide, you remember the Tale of Tears. This is the expulsion of the American Indians from their homelands and sent out west to a place like Oklahoma. Now to the American perspective, number 4. The War of 1812 became a source of national pride, thanks to the successful defense of Baltimore and Fort McHenry, and due to great victories at sea and in New Orleans. The end of the war ushered in the era of good feeling and a sense of manifest destiny, in America from sea to shining sea. Next slide. Commodore Perry, who was the victor at Lake Erie, he had the famous flag, "Don't give up the ship." You see in this slide, he's being canonized. There's an angel there putting a halo over him. We owe allegiance to no crown, it says it above. Great feelings arose at the end. Now, so unlike the British, Canadian, and Indian versions, this version is hard to follow, to swallow, I should say. And you have to think what has happened. We had our capital burned. The Canadians beat us 10 times. New England almost seceded from the Union, came very close to seceding from the Union at the end of the war. And if not for Plattsburgh, we would have lost the war. And yet we must feel so triumphant at the time they did. The feeling was so wonderful about our great accomplishment. And that hasn't really changed today. Let's take a look at where the federal money is spent, because this is the 200th anniversary from 2012 to 2014 is the 200th anniversary of the war. And there have been a lot of events that have been taking place. Slide. Fort McHenry. So we have the great bombardment there on September 13th, 14th, 1814. And we have the next one, the Battle of New Orleans, January 1815. Next, the burning of the White House. Oh, sorry, next slide. I put a censored on that. As it happens, the British were not invited to Washington to burn the White House once again. So that didn't happen. And remember Dolly Madison, next slide. She saved the White House silverware just before the troops came in and burned the place. And although the hero Dolly was asked to do that, next slide, Michelle Obama was not asked to reenact the removal of the silverware from the White House. Next slide. But the U.S. government's lack of emphasis on the burning of Washington is actually fine with me, because most people think that this was a prime objective of the British, to really teach us a lesson, to burn our capital, and this was a decisive move. But as we will see, the true purpose of the burning of Washington, as was revealed by Keith Hiralko in that book that I showed you before, and I'm going to spill the beans about the central point of my discussion. The attack on Washington was a diversionary attack to draw attention away from, you guessed it, the battle at Plattsburgh. Next slide. Fort McHenry. Let's take that one. 1812 celebration money by the federal government, lots of it spent around there. Flag waving and marching and all sorts of things went on. Most of the money was there. We know the story even from grade school. Next slide. Francis Scott Key, the Star-Spangled Banner. He sat aboard a British ship out in Baltimore Bay, trying to negotiate the freedom of a friend of his who had been captured. And as the song goes, the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in the air, the fort held, the flag still flew, the national anthem was born. Hooray! Great. Not mentioned in school was that the Americans had sunk some of their own beaten up old ships out in the harbor, which prevented the British ships from getting very close to Fort McHenry. This made it almost impossible for them to actually hit the fort. They'd hit it with a few lucky shots, but their chances of actually destroying it were virtually nil. It really was just a spectacular fireworks display. And can you guess, the attack was not meant to take Fort McHenry. It was a diversion for the Battle of Plattsburgh. Let's take the Battle of New Orleans. Went too far. As the song goes, we fired our cannon and the British came to running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. It was a great song, huh? Andrew Jackson's triumph there was spectacular. That really was something to celebrate. Of course, the only problem was that attack took place weeks after the War of 1812 had ended. So, and I might also add, this attack, like the others, was a diversion to the main attack at Plattsburgh. I wish I had a podium so that I could turn my pages easily. This is a little awkward. But the podium is falling apart, they told me. It's in pieces. They must have attacked the presenter. Next slide. The USS Constitution against the Guerriere. Old Ironsides. Now, there were several brilliant naval victories at sea. Absolutely brilliant. Heroic things happened. And on the Great Lakes as well. Next slide. But those impressive victories did nothing to change, reverse the overwhelming superiority that the British had, despite fighting Napoleon at sea around the United States. And you see that line of ships there on the coast, running along all the way to New Orleans, sealing us off from the Caribbean, from Europe, from everything. Next one. Henry Bathurst, 3rd Earl of Bathurst, I guess, British Secretary of War. He's the man who came up with the idea of coastal attacks on Washington, Baltimore, and New Orleans as diversions for the main attack from Canada. Next slide. You see, Napoleon had abdicated in April 1814 and was sent with his family to the island of Elba. So he was out of the picture for the time. He would escape from Elba and do some things in 1815, but for now, he's out of the picture. With his defeat in exile then, a war in North America that had been up to this point just a sideshow for the British now became the main order of business. And Bathurst was determined that he, who had conducted the war against Napoleon, he would now deliver a decisive blow against the United States. Next slide. The Duke of Wellington, who had defeated Wellington, and we'll deal with him again later, he agreed to send, next slide, 16,000 hardened, battle-tested troops from France to North America. 16,000 of them. Not only that, several of his battle-tested major generals were sent as well. So they were really dealing with strength, and they're serious about what they're doing. Next slide. But where to strike? Where to strike? Should they punch in at the Chesapeake Bay? Or should they go up further up the Potomac and start chasing Dolly Madison and James Madison around the countryside, maybe picking up pieces of silver that fall off their wagon train and go way inland? No, they're afraid of doing that. And also, the reason is, how could they supply 10,000 troops in a place like that? From Canada? No. From England? No. From the Caribbean? You can't do that. That would not work. And the same reasoning would apply to a place like New Orleans. That's not a place you can deal a tremendous, long-standing blow. So the British war documents make it very clear, and I have a copy of this a little bit. This is sent by Bathurst to General Ross, who commanded all of the Canadian troops. You are not to engage in any extended operations at a distance, meaning inland, from the coast. You are not to do that. He wanted to strike a powerful blow that he could sustain for years. It could not be done inland from the coast. And so, he decided the logical choice was to attack down from Canada, down Lake Champlain. Why? Well, it's only 63 miles from Montreal. And Montreal is on the St. Lawrence. And so constant flow of supplies can be maintained if that battle will succeed. And so in May 1814, he sent 11,000 of those 16,000 troops to Canada to prepare a blow at Plattsburgh. And as I said before, this was the largest enemy force ever assembled on the North American continent. He also issued diversion orders, next one, created diversion on the coast of the United States in favor of the Army in Canada. This order came just a couple of months before the actual ones that we see, which were Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Fort McHenry, things like that. It took longer to assemble the troops for New Orleans, but that was considered part of the order. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Americans wanted peace, and so did the British. Things were not really going that great for either side, and peace was wanted. But by backwards calculation, everything was changing now. He would have now the decisive bargaining chip at Ghent, which is in modern-day Belgium. The British diplomats were told what was happening. They were told that there were diversionary attacks, Washington, Baltimore, etc. And they also knew about the main attack at Plattsburgh. And when news came about the burning of the Capitol at Washington, they were overjoyed. They didn't even wait for the news at Plattsburgh. They slammed new demands on the table, on the negotiating table. And this upset John Quincy Adams, who would later be the sixth president of the United States. He was the head of the American delegation. He was in a terrible position at this moment, just having heard news about the burning of his capital. Next. Now that the British fleet was no longer needed in Europe, they completely sealed up the United States, eastern seaboard, and the Gulf of Mexico. So totally that the U.S. no longer could get any revenue from ships, from imports and exports. Zero. Now this was the main source of the revenue of the United States. It wasn't taxes on people, that didn't exist. It was mostly from commerce. When they were sealed off, revenue became zero, and the Treasury was going broke. And Adams knew this. But even worse trouble than going broke, if you can imagine, was to come. Next. This is an image from 1814, talking about the Hartford Convention of Secessionists. New England was considering very strongly seceding from the Union. This shows, that's poor Rhode Island, little Rhode Island in the middle. He's being pulled by Massachusetts and pushed by Connecticut into the arms of King George of England. Now things were really serious at this time because the little island of Nantucket, or just off to a part of New England, they had already in effect seceded from the United States. They signed an agreement with Britain saying that all of their revenue, all their taxes would be paid to the king and no longer to the U.S. They had de facto seceded from the United States. Also, New Englanders were sending war materials and food and other supplies to the British in Canada in preparation for their attack. New Englanders were doing this. Vermont and New Hampshire. Throughout those states were sending materials to the Canadians. This was a terrible situation that the U.S. was in. The British, in effect, had their hands around the U.S.'s throat. If this battle could succeed, tremendous things would happen on the negotiating side for the British. Let's have the next slide. The British negotiators now demanded, once Washington had been burned, demanded the following. Let's see what it demands. Exclusive military control of the Great Lakes. Full access to the Mississippi River for its entire length. Now, of course, here they assumed that the Battle of New Orleans would be won in their direction. They demanded a sovereign Indian state in Canada and across much of the U.S. territories of Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. A sovereign Indian state. At this point, the British held 10 million acres in those areas. So if the British could win at Plattsburgh, what changes could have been taken place in the United States? Here's a theoretical example. This hypothetical map shows the sovereign nation of Indiana. Imagine that. The sovereign nation of Indiana, from Ohio all the way up into Wisconsin. Amazing. And let's look at New England. You see that green part on the far right? That would be the independent states of New England, not part of the United States. Now by now, next one, you're probably wondering when I was ever going to get to the actual Battle of Plattsburgh that I've been saying has been so important and so brilliantly fought. And the 200th anniversary just passed. It was August 11th, 2014, unnoticed in the United States, except in the village of Plattsburgh. No, you don't find stamps of it. You'll find stamps about the Battle of New Orleans, about Fort McHenry. I don't think you see about the burning of Washington, but you will never see a stamp about the Battle of Plattsburgh. But I hope you'll find it worth the wait, because this was absolutely one of the most brilliantly fought land and sea battles in the history of the United States. Next slide. This is British Lieutenant General Georges Prevost. He was the commandant of all of the British and Canadian forces in Canada. Now, in August 2014, he and Navy Captain George Downey were at the north end of the lake, Lake Champlain, at the Canadian border. They were preparing to execute Lord Bathurst's, from London, his commands to invade. And Prevost knew just what stakes there were, because he had explicit orders from Bathurst. Let's see those orders. Bathurst wrote, regarding Lake Champlain, we will expel the enemy from it and occupy it. We will restore the whole of Detroit and the Michigan Territory to the Indians. Our success shall enable us to terminate the war. What a powerful statement. You saw that theoretical map I just showed you? It wasn't theoretical in Bathurst's mind or in Georges Prevost's mind. This was the plan of the British. Occupy the entirety of Lake Champlain, my goodness. Hold Detroit, the Michigan Territory. Terminate the war. That was the plan. Let's see the map of East Coast once again. Now, by early September of 1814, the planned diversions were already beginning. 2 weeks before the attack at Plattsburgh, Washington, D.C.'s government buildings had been burned to the ground and were now a smoldering ruin. The ships were standing off Fort McHenry and off Baltimore, scaring the life out of the Americans who were on shore. Next slide. On Lake Ontario, you see it there in the middle, the British had just defeated the Americans at Fort Niagara in another diversionary attack. And now they were threatening to attack other ports on the lake, ports such as Sackett's Harbor. And in a terrible misjudgment by the U.S. command in Washington, what's left of Washington, they ordered 4,000 troops to leave Plattsburgh at the absolute wrong time, because they were afraid of these attacks on the decoy attacks on Lake Ontario. And so those men left. About a week and a half after they're gone, Major General Alexander McComb, let's have his picture, he's in charge of Plattsburgh. He gets word from Indian spies that these tremendous numbers of troops are now on the march, coming down from Canada. He had only 1,500 men left, and most of them were unfit for marching out to Lake Ontario. These were the loose pieces that were left behind. He was desperate. He immediately called up 2,000 local men. Now, these were men who did not know how to march in order. They couldn't execute a command. But one thing they could do, they were local militia. They could shoot a deer with a musket from 100 yards and kill it. So these guys knew what they're doing, but were not an army by any means. So no military training. This gave him a total of 3,500 men, mostly untrained or unfit for duty, to fight 10,000 battle-hardened veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, the residents of the city of Plattsburgh, they could see the handwriting on the wall. They left Sloan. Everyone left Plattsburgh. There wasn't a soul in the town. On the dawn of September 11th, 1814, the 10,000 troops attacked the city, supported by 16 ships in Lake Champlain. And speaking of ships, this was the only area where the Americans had an equal advantage to the British. The commander of the British fleet was, we won't see his picture, but we see his gravestone, because he was killed in action that day. 33-year-old British Navy Captain George Downey. That's his tombstone up in Plattsburgh. He had 16 ships on the lake, and they could fire 1/2 ton of hot iron in a mass broadside at the enemy. Against him was this fellow, U.S. Master Commandant Thomas McDonough, only 31 years old. The U.S. fleet on the lake had 14 ships, so 2 less than the British, but a bit more pounds per ship, and so it came out to be exactly 1/2 ton of hot lead, hot iron, that he could throw at the British. So they were really evenly matched. Let's see the map of Lake Champlain. Hope this comes out on the screen. Yeah, it does. Good. I gave a presentation at Hofstra, and their projector didn't even show this. I warmed up for this by doing a presentation at a university. So this is the main audience here. Now, on this map, the dark parts are the land, and the light parts are the bay. So the British troops, you see George Provost's troops there north of Plattsburgh, 10,000 men, and you see Macomb is below Plattsburgh. He's got his 3,500 troops. This mismatch on land should have been decisive, absolutely decisive. And once the British would take the heights from here, should have hold paper there also, but they could take the heights here by crossing the Saranac River. They could then turn the American guns and their own cannon at the American ships. That would make it simple for the British ships to attack the Americans. And that was the original plan. Bathurst's plan, I suppose, back in London. But when you plan a battle in London, it's not like fighting a battle at Plattsburgh. And so things changed. This is what one of Provost's generals wrote after the battle. Next slide. It appears to me that the army moved against Plattsburgh without any regularly digested plan. Well, the fact is they did have a plan, but the enemy, unfortunately, doesn't follow your battle plan. And that's what Macomb did. He did something they did not expect. He employed a guerrilla defense. As British General Robinson later said, next slide, the Americans do not fight like gentlemen, but rather behind rocks and trees. Well, what are you going to do when you don't have trained troops, but they know how to shoot? Yeah, that's what they did, and it was totally unexpected by the British. Next slide. So Georges Prevost, General Prevost, with his long lines of troops and terrific orderly marching, they were suffering from withering fire from all sides as they approached Plattsburgh. He now imagined, because Macomb also stacked some of his first-class troops on the other side of the Saranac, looking like an orderly regiment. He imagined that the 4,000 troops that he had heard had been sent off to Lake Ontario had now returned. Because also, what Macomb did, in the night, he had had fires lit all around in the hillsides, as if he had troops all around the place. There was no one at the fires. They just kept them lit here and there and everywhere. So he became uneasy, George Prevost, quite uneasy. Next. So Prevost, next. Prevost now decided to change the plan. Well, how can one side of your battle attack change a plan that affects another side that isn't understanding what you're doing? Prevost now decided that he must, instead of attacking the Americans and then firing on the British ships should attack the American ships. And then once having beaten the American ships, could fire on the Americans on shore. In other words, reversing the whole thing that was supposed to have taken place. And that's what actually did happen. Signals must have been sent out to the British fleet to attack, and attack they did. Next slide. And so up the fleet came into the bay. 2 hours of battle. Prevost was looking with his eyeglass from shore. He cannot believe what he sees. Only 2 hours later, white flags are flying from every one of the 4 main British ships. The other, I guess 14 or 16 of them, I can't remember what, the smaller ships, were fleeing north, back up to the north end of Lake Champlain. Next one. And the next one. Teddy Roosevelt wrote about that battle. He wrote about the whole war in this book, The Naval War of 1812. And in it he said, this was the greatest naval battle of the war. So it wasn't the Constitution, it wasn't the battle with Perry. It was this battle at Lake Champlain. Next. And Commandant MacDonough, the American commandant of this fleet, the greatest figure in our naval history. Of course, he hadn't seen World War I or II yet. This was done. This was his first book, so he was a young man at the time. And you in the audience, and I, had never heard of MacDonough. I may have heard of the Battle of Plattsburgh, but not much. The greatest figure in our naval history. So how did the American fleet defeat the British fleet in 2 hours? It's astounding, with equal throw weight from each one of the sets of ships, each of the fleets. He did it the same way that Alexander McCollum had done it on land. He outsmarted them. Planning and execution. Precision, planning, and execution. Next slide. Oh, I didn't show you the picture of MacDonough yet. Oh, I did. Anyway.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Okay. All right, next slide. Now, the British fleet sailed up the bay, as the arrows show. And as you see, there's a gray ship in the middle that is lined up against an American ship. That was the way they swung around to fire a broadside at the Americans. And the Americans fired a broadside back. But what the British didn't plan on was what the Americans had planned. They had practiced this out in the lake, in secret, a technique of dropping anchors out at a distance from the ships, with cables attached to windlasses, capstans on the deck of the ship. So that when they hauled on the cables, they could spin the ships around. And thus, while the British have to reload their starboard guns, the Americans have swung their starboard side around in the opposite way and now have the preloaded port side guns blasting at the British. And while they're swinging it around, they're reloading the starboard side guns and swinging it around again and again and again. By the conclusion of the battle, they inspected the hulls of the British ships compared to the American ships. 5 times as many cannon holes in the sides of the British as there were in the sides of the Americans. 2 evenly matched fleets, but a total decisive victory on the part of the American side. Now, meanwhile, back in Ghent, they have no news from Plattsburgh. As far as they know, things are going even worse after the burning of Washington. In fact, Henry Clay, who's one of the chief negotiators, had this to say: I tremble each time I pick up a late newspaper. Will I read that General Prevost is advancing on New York? That's what they're thinking at the time. They've got no news about Plattsburgh because it takes about 3 weeks for the shipping news to get across the Atlantic. Next slide. Now, Lord Liverpool is the Prime Minister. That's Bathurst's boss, in effect. But it did take a few weeks to get there, the news about Plattsburgh. Liverpool was so shocked, devastated at the news. His war strategy, Bathurst strategy, was in tatters. Their appetite for fighting in North America was at an end. They wanted no more. This was decisive. He told the negotiators at Ghent, pull all your demands off the table. All of them off the table. We just want an equal thing. We want things the way they were. We don't want to do this anymore. Gone was the demand for military control of the Great Lakes. Gone was the demand that they have access to the Mississippi from New Orleans up into Minnesota. Gone was the right of sovereign nation for the Indians in all of that incredible amount of territory. Gone from the table. Next slide. And this is how the status quo came about, leaving all the borders and everything as it was before the war. But when the history books say, the ones I read, that the War of 1812 was this meaningless war that ended nowhere, ended in a draw, give barely a mention to this incredible battle at Plattsburgh. They missed the pivotal point of the activity in this war. This was a war that up until the last 2 hours of it, with that battle on the lake, could have gone either way. Next slide. And if not for these two men, Thomas MacDonough, Alexander McComb, on September 11, 1814, two brilliant leaders, if they had not together used their incredible intelligence, resources, bravery, it's hard to really imagine what exactly the United States would look like today. And let's take a look one last time of what might have been if things had gone differently, if different men had been there. It's an image to ponder. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, Art, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Just to clarify, it may be difficult to answer this one. The Canadian version, your version number 2, that interesting picture that you showed us, somebody called Isaac Brock, and then off to the right, there is a picture of the island of Guernsey, Sark, and was it Jersey? I'm not sure. Anyway, what was the connection to those islands?
Are you speaking about the Battle of York?
No, I'm speaking about a slide that you showed us when you went over the various versions of the Battle of Plattsburgh. This was the Canadian version, and there's a picture of this Isaac. I didn't quite get the last name because I'm a little too far away to read it. He's on a horse, and then there's a map of Guernsey and Sark. I just wondered.
You're saying Guernsey, those islands are off Great Britain?
Yes, they are. That's why I'm asking you. I'm thinking, how do these islands fit into that? I was just curious.
The islands in Great Britain don't fit at all.
What that was all about. That's really what I'm asking you.
Is it this picture?
No. No. It's version number 2. And it may not be possible for you to find it and answer the question, in which case, not to worry about it.
Version 1, one more down, okay.
It's an interesting picture, and I'm just curious.
That's this.
No.
Right above is the slide for version 2. There's nothing about Guernsey.
Well, you were talking about this guy who was, that's it, you got it, you nailed it.
Okay.
You see down there in the corner, there's Guernsey and Sark.
Let me see if I can pick it up.
And I'm just wondering, what's that all about, and who this guy, over Canada.
Okay. All right, I'll tell you.
Guernsey, you see the map as a stamp.
Yeah, I'll tell you what that was. I can't remember the exact ships. I didn't realize that was there. I never kind of looked at that corner. Okay. An American ship actually went into the English Channel and captured major vessels of the British.
Oh, and I knew there was a story.
Yeah. It was a shock to the British that the Americans could do that. So as I said, there were some dramatic victories, isolated victories of the Constitution And the guys here, also down in the Caribbean, they captured something like 1,600, it's a huge number
Yeah.
of British ships.
And I
But
can
this
see
really-
it, I
when the
can see it
blockade-
now. It says that this guy, Brock, who was the hero, was born in Guernsey. But, oh, he was killed in the Battle of Queenstown Heights.
Yeah, it does say Guernsey, yeah.
Okay, all right, I was just curious, I
Yeah.
thought it was an interesting picture.
Okay, you picked up something I never even noticed.
And there's a stamp commemorating it.
Oh, sure, the British are, I mean, the Canadians are very proud of all of this, yes.
And the other question was, what was Downey's first name?
George
George?
Downey, I'm pretty sure.
I missed that.
George Downey.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody disbelieve me?
So how come, I know about Roosevelt writing that book, like it was one of his first books that he wrote, not too long ago.
That was his first.
First, I think he was actually in college when he wrote it, or
Oh, maybe.
slightly
It
after
was
this.
quite early.
With all this, with all that and everything, and I saw something on Roosevelt that a lot of people in the Army, that was the go-to book on the Navy.
Uh-huh.
How come Plattsburgh, the Battle of Plattsburgh, never got any of the publicity that it should?
You know, I was asked this question in Hofstra too, and I tried to think about it. It's
I
got to
was
be.
gonna ask the same
it's
thing.
just-
They teach this battle to the Army and to the Navy, or to the Navy, I guess, when they're teaching these young cadets.
Well, it wouldn't be meaningful today because nobody fights at close quarters like that. You're fighting
But the
over the horizon.
intellectuality of these men, I think,
Well,
is very
it's funny you
critical.
asked that. I was in a Naval Reserve at Columbia University, and I did study naval history there. And we studied many battles of Trafalgar, et cetera, et cetera. You know, World War II battles, many. We never talked about the Battle of Plattsburgh. But why? I'm not sure other than where it is. It's such a godforsaken, cold place up there. I don't really know why. It's a puzzle, and it deserves attention. It really does.
And now, the other thing, Art, that's interesting is that Commodore Perry is the guy who founded the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Oh, okay.
That was his original house.
Yeah.
That's on the Navy Yard grounds.
Oh, I did want to cite my sources. Actually, I didn't do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We know about Francis Scott Key, but we don't know about Thomas McDonough.
No, that's right.
So you gotta put it, like New Orleans, you gotta put it to music to make people remember, just like in kindergarten.
That's right. Now, this book was pretty good. 166 pages, 2 pages about Plattsburgh. That's that. This one, 191 pages, 7 pages about Plattsburgh. That's giving it something. This was a fine book, 349 pages, 17 pages about Plattsburgh. Then the one that was by the historian up at Plattsburgh, 191 pages, all about Plattsburgh. Of course, because it's about, the subject is the Battle of Plattsburgh. And he's the guy who went through the trouble of going to the archives so that we can see those commands that came out of England, which that's not been known by historians. That was original research. I felt good about that because after all, when I did my book about the 2 shipwrecks, I was going to newspapers of the day and documents to crew lists and things that, this paper that I'm going through from 175 years old. So I can identify with Keith Hiralco about what he did. And that's part of the reason, I guess, it hasn't got the attention. No one ever did the full research about it. And finally, Teddy Roosevelt. This is me at the Oyster Festival in 2014. You've seen this reenactor around. Well, I asked him, I said to Teddy, you wrote that book about the War of 1812, but it seems like the Battle of Plattsburgh hasn't gotten enough attention. Well, it should, he says. It was the most important battle he knew. This Teddy Roosevelt reenactor had read the book and knew about the battle and how important it was.
I think she brought up a good point. We need a song about it or something. They said that, in the Revolutionary War, that Paul Revere wasn't the only person going around telling everybody the British was coming. But the one thing he had, nobody else had, he had a poem written about himself.
Okay, that's it. There you go. I think that's right. Yes, Dennis?
Is Macomb's Dam Park in the Bronx,
Oh,
named
wow.
after Macomb, and if so, where's McDonough's recognition?
Amen,
Well,
amen.
McDonough did get a lot of recognition at the time. He was celebrated in Washington. He was a genuine hero. There was no question about it. They recognized what he had done.
It's got a portrait by, Gilbert Stewart.
Stewart.
Yeah.
Gilbert Stewart, the guy who did the portrait of George Washington. The most famous portrait artist of the time, did Thomas McDonough. Yeah, so he got what he deserved. A lot of praise.
Just another thought,
Yeah.
Art, and it's maybe tough to answer this one too. You mentioned the Trail of Tears,
Yes,
and of course, Andrew Jackson was largely responsible
he
for that.
absolutely was.
Now, can you just clarify again, how is that trail, it started down in the south, how is that connected to the War of 1812?
Well, it followed immediately after, and it's the consequence. I mean, had there been a sovereign nation up where it was, it may still have happened. You're asking what if? It could still have happened because the Americans wanted to move west. They wanted the Indians out.
Right.
But I would guess that they wouldn't have gone to Oklahoma, but they would have gone to their sovereign nation of Indiana, which wouldn't have been that
Okay.
much further, in fact, maybe even closer than Oklahoma. That's my guess.
Mhm.
And you'd be in an independent nation as opposed to a territory of the United States.
That's right, it would not be a territory of the United States. Yes.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming out.
Great.